After you've been in the production music world a while, it's sometimes too easy to throw around jargon or terminology that unless you're kind of inside the industry, you have no idea what we're talking about. Like, what's a PRO? Why do you keep using the term cues? What's back-end royalties? And what's the difference between sync and library music? Well, on this episode, I want to welcome you into Professor Dave's classroom as I go over the sync music vocabulary you should know, but maybe we're afraid to ask. What is happening, everybody? This is Dave Croft, and welcome back to another episode of the 52 Cues podcast, where each week we explore the world of production and library music. So whether you are brand new to the industry or maybe you're already seeing a ton of placements, either way, I promise you, you are in the right place. As always, a huge word of thanks to the family, friends, and neighbor subscribers who are composers just like you, looking to write better cues and find success in the sync music business. And 52 Cues is there to help with live streams, workshops, Zoom feedback sessions, and a ton more. If you're interested in joining us at 52 Cues, you can head over to 52cues.com or stick around because I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later in today's episode. Speaking of later in today's episode, I'm going to be playing for you my final no-pizzicato dramedy cue. This is called Merry-Go-Round, as in Will You Marry Me? Merry-Go-Round, which is a 3/4 waltz that features melodica run through a Hammond B3 rotor cabinet. So you definitely want to stick around for that. But let's go ahead and dive into today's topic. Like I said in the intro, it is so easy for those of us kind of in the business to use inside lingo that unless you've been around the block a couple of times, you probably don't know what some of these terms mean. And maybe you're intimidated or maybe a little embarrassed to ask. So I wanted to, again, welcome you into Professor Dave's classroom as we go over the sync music vocabulary that you should know, but have been afraid to ask. So let's start off with the very, very first, production music. What is production music? How does it differ from library music? And what about sync music? Are all these just synonyms? Well, yes and no. Production music is music that's created specifically for use in media that's typically intended for licensing rather than public performance or commercial release. This isn't necessarily bespoke music. We are not scoring to picture. We write music that lives in a catalog that music supervisors or editors or producers can download and add into their media projects. So that's what production music is. Library music is somewhat synonymous with production music, although I have found that library music to some seems a little more pejorative, kind of like, stock music or muzak. And so production music is the larger, kind of broader label that encapsulates everything from music that you might hear in an investigation show or music like for a trailer and kind of everything in between. How does this differ from sync music? Well, sync music is music that gets synchronized, and this is where we get sync from. But in my experience talking to editors and publishers, when they think sync music, they're really thinking more either commercially released music that gets synchronized or music that has lyrics or more kind of commercial type song forms, like hip hop or R&B, rock, EDM. Those types of cues, those types of tracks get used, and they call that sync. All right. So what about cue? What does cue mean? Well, a cue is a piece of music typically written for media that exists to fulfill a purpose or a mood within a scene. So a cue is an instrumental piece of music written specifically for use in media. Now, not all cues are production music, and not all production music are necessarily cues. Cues, in my definition, describes instrumental pieces of music. So you can have cues in film, you can have cues in television, you can have cues in games. And this term is shared with like film scoring. I don't use the term song because song implies lyrics. I don't like using the term track because track is somewhat of a nebulous term. Do you mean like a song? Do you mean like a track in a DAW session or whatever? So we use the term cues. This is where we get the name 52 cues from. The idea is we're focusing on writing at least one high quality cue every week throughout the year. All right, so next up, publisher. What is the publisher? How does it differ from a library and catalog? Aren't those all kind of meaning the same thing? Well, yes and no. A publisher is an entity that administers the compositional rights of a song or a cue and ensures that it's properly registered, licensed, and that royalties are collected and distributed. Think of it this way. A publisher is a person. A publisher is a human being that runs a company that distributes and signs rights and licenses music that lives within their catalog, which is a collection of cues or tracks or songs that is owned by and managed by a publisher or a library. We'll talk about library here in a second. These catalogs are often organized by genre, mood, or even intended use. So you have a publisher, which is a person, and the person manages a catalog. And the business entity that houses that catalog is the library, which is a company or platform that houses a catalog of production music cues, which are available for licensing. Now, yes, you will hear these terms all used relatively synonymously, like I got published on a catalog, or the publisher, I was talking to the publisher, or I was talking to the library. But again, think of it, the publisher owns a company, which is the library, and the library has within it the catalog. And we could even dig a little bit deeper because catalogs can be divided up into albums, and albums could be divided up by intended usage or by concepts. Like here's a whole album of marimba, plucky dramedy music, or here's an album of quirky pizzicato, playful cues, right? Or dark EDM or surreal, distorted synths or whatever. And so again, publisher, catalog, and library. Now, there are a couple of different types of libraries or business entities that you are likely to encounter when you are looking to get published. First, an exclusive library. This is a library that does require full ownership or at least exclusive rights to a cue, and this does prevent you from licensing it elsewhere. Now, when you're signing with an exclusive library, it is not you, the composer, being exclusive to the library. It's the cue itself that's exclusive. That means you can't retitle it, you can't go have it put somewhere else, and you can't shop it around to other libraries, which is different from a non-exclusive library, which is a library that does allow you, the composer, to license the same cue to multiple clients or libraries. Now, in my experience, most non-exclusive libraries do require that you maintain not a publishing share, but you have to establish yourself as a publisher, and then the contract will sign that the publisher has rights to the publishing share of the cues that they get placed. It can get a little complicated. And I believe that with current technology and Content ID and TuneSats and Track.io and SoundMouse and all of those, that non-exclusive libraries, not only do they typically not land the most lucrative placements, there are exceptions to this, but typically I see them kind of going away because the technology is getting more and more difficult to track where these placements are landing. So let's say that you have a cue in 2 non-exclusive libraries. It's the same title. You're well within your legal bounds to do that. And then those 2 libraries pitch to the same show. And now your cue is showing up on this show, but who gets the royalty attribution? It creates a headache. So in my experience, nearly all of my cues are signed with an exclusive library, and most exclusive libraries will assume the copyrights, which sounds big and scary until you remember that copyright really has to do with who owns where the music can go, not necessarily who owns the music. Copyright means who has the right to do something with the cue. And so for me, I don't necessarily want to perform my cue live. I'm not going to go sell a bunch of records. I'm not looking to print sheet music for it or anything. So I'm fine for an exclusive library to assume copyrights. But even if they don't require full ownership, they will ask for an exclusive deal. Like they will say, we will have your cue exclusively for 5 years, and that might carry forward if you meet some kind of threshold. So we have exclusive libraries. Again, remember that is not you, the composer, exclusive, but it's the cues that live in their catalog. And then you have non-exclusive libraries, which I believe I believe their time is short, which brings us to stock music libraries, which are libraries that contain tracks or cues that are made available to content creators, not just, music supervisors, not just editors and directors and producers, but anybody can go to the Pond 5s or the Audio Jungles or the Envato Elements or whatever, and through that platform, it's a marketplace, you can pay a subscription or you can pay a one-time fee, and you have access to that cue or that track. The upside is it's very low barrier of entry, especially compared with pitching to a library. The downside of stock music is this is the lowest hanging fruit in the production music pipeline. And this is the industry that I think is going to get obliterated by AI. A lot of it is somewhat low effort, low risk, low stakes. A Netflix show isn't going to necessarily go license a piece of music off of Pond 5 before they will go to an exclusive library, go to Extreme or 5 Alarm or Atomica or whatever, right? There's just so much more money involved in the production itself that they're not going to risk using just a stock music cue from Pond 5 or Audio Jungle. And not to hate on those industries or those catalogs, but by the way, I just used the term catalog for library. And so I'm not hating on those catalogs, but it's kind of the lowest hanging fruit. All right, so let's dig a little bit deeper. What is a brief? A brief is a creative request that is issued by the library that usually specifies mood, genre, emotion, maybe tempo, maybe length, or the structure of the cue that is needed for placement. And it could be for various reasons. It could be, hey, we're submitting music to a show and the music supervisors have asked for these cues. Or it could be that we are putting a compilation together, and so we are making an album of music for sports or music for dating shows. So you will get a brief and you get to reply to it. Usually a turnaround, if there's any upfront money or sync fees, we'll talk about that here in just a second. That's usually disclosed in the brief as well. Due dates, deadlines, all of that in the brief, as well as, I don't know if I mentioned this, but reference material. You might get reference link. This is what the music supervisor likes, or this is what we as the library think represents what the client is looking for. So what it means now to get signed to a library, in my experience, is they have agreed to put your music in their catalog, and it usually also means that you are in their email blast. Or you get a login to their composer portal so that you can see what briefs are running, what are they looking for right now. So that's what a brief is. So if you are looking to get your music published and you are looking to have it signed and get music on TV, you have to join a PRO, aka Performing Rights Organization, which is an agency like ASCAP, BMI, or CSAC in the US, or SOCAN in Canada, or JASRAC in Japan, or GEMA in Germany, or PRS, I think it's PRS in the UK. These are agencies that collects and distributes public performance royalties to songwriters and publishers. Now, they know what to collect and what to pay off due to the cue sheets that they receive. A cue sheet is a document submitted to a PRO that details all of the music used in a production. This includes titles, durations, composers, publishers, the type of usage it was, how long the usage was. And cue sheets take a long time to tabulate. They take a long time to get to the PROs, and the PROs absorb all of those cue sheets and then generate the payments based on their internal algorithms. And I've talked about, how long it takes to get paid and PROs and all of that. But the cue sheet is a spreadsheet that outlines all of the cues that are used in any given production. So let's keep going. Let's actually talk about royalties. First of all, there are two main types of royalties. The one that we are most interested in are performance royalties. And these are payments to composers and publishers when their music is played publicly, such as TV, radio, live concerts, streaming services, or what have you. And these are collected by the PROs. And sometimes these are called back-end royalties. So the difference between performance royalties and mechanical royalties is if performance royalties are royalties paid out for some sort of public performance, and I don't mean playing live, I mean it gets used. Mechanical royalties are payments to songwriters and publishers when their music is copied or sold, like for CDs or downloads or streams on platforms like Spotify or Apple Music. And things like Pandora makes this a little complicated. We typically don't do a lot with mechanical royalties because our entire world is dominated by performance royalties. But as soon as you put your music on the DSPs, and as soon as somebody buys your cue or your song through Apple Music or whatever, and that they can control how they play it, so it's not radio, then now we are looking at performance royalties. And then finally, you might hear the term royalty-free. And royalty-free is a licensing model where clients can pay once, usually through a subscription or a one-time fee, or sometimes they don't pay anything. And so they can use a cue, but they don't have to pay additional royalties for every single use. These are called royalty-free. Royalty-free cues or royalty-free loops, Splice or royalty-free. If you use something from a Splice catalog, a Splice loop, you pay your one-time fee, you pay your subscription, and you don't have to pay the artist who created that loop every single time you use it. Also, most tracks that you find on stock music sites are considered royalty-free. You can register those with the PROs, but if you buy it royalty-free, the client who licenses that is not obligated to report your placement to the PROs. So that is royalty-free. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into some kind of payment terminology. First of all, sync license. And a sync license is a legal agreement that grants permission to synchronize any piece of music with visual media, such as film, TV, or advertisements. And this is why the term sync music kind of applies to any piece of music that gets used in film, TV, advertisements, media, whatever. They require a sync license, and most sync licenses come with an upfront sync fee. Okay? A sync fee is an upfront payment that's made for the right to synchronize a piece of music to visual media. So if somebody is looking to license a song that you wrote, then they often will pay an upfront sync fee. And this is actually a little bit different from a consideration fee. And I actually don't have this, I don't have a definition for this, but a consideration fee is an upfront fee often paid by a library for production music that's really like kind of an honorarium or just a payment so that they can put your music in the catalog. So when I write music that goes up to Discovery Channel, through the arrangement of the publisher I work with, there are some consideration fees and I get a little bit of money. It's not a ton, but there is a little upfront money. Most of the types of licensing deals that we might see in the production music space are going to be blanket licenses. And this is a flat fee agreement that gives a client access to an entire music library's catalog over a defined period of time. And so you might have a production company, it could be Netflix, could be Discovery Channel or whatever, will sign a blanket licensing deal with a publisher so that they can access anything in their catalog over a certain defined time period. So we will give you $10,000 and we have the rights to use. Now, we still have to report. They still have to report those to the PROs. They still have to generate cue sheets, but they aren't giving, they don't write checks every single time a piece of music gets used. So for the vast majority of the libraries I work with, they are working with blanket licensing deals. And most of the sports stuff, it's all blanket license. It's the agreement between like a network and a library. They can use anything they want for X amount of time, but they are not going to necessarily pay upfront every single time. Let's look at a couple of other types of fees and payment ideas. First of all, there is a work for hire. You might hear this term. And this is an arrangement in which a composer actually gives up ownership in lieu of a one-time fee, and they have no future claims to any future royalties. Sometimes this gets a little confused with a buyout, and the term buyout can be used to kind of mean this, but in general, I see this described as a work for hire. That means that they are giving you money and you cannot claim any ownership over it. You won't get any future royalties. It's a writer's share or the publisher share or whatever. But in general, work for hires are going to be like a lot of game music. It's considered work for hires. Stuff for corporate, one-offs is work for hires. If you do any ghost writing, that is also considered a work for hire. Work for hire also will show up if you are bringing in, not a collaborator, but if you're bringing in somebody to play bass on your cue or to play guitar or maybe sing top lines or whatever, you can hire them and pay for their services under a work for hire agreement, which means that you give them a few $100 and they don't receive any back-end royalties. Okay. There is also, like I said, a buyout, which is a licensing agreement where the composer is paid a one-time fee that gives the buyer full or long-term rights to use the music without necessarily owing additional payments. Royalties still might be able to be collected. Okay. Now, sometimes the buyouts are lucrative. Sometimes the work for hires are lucrative. I would say that if you are signing a work for hire and it is an actual finished cue and you did all the work, I would expect, considerable upfront money, unless it's worth it to have it in your catalog or on your reel. For example, and I think I've talked about this before, I did some work for Disney and they gave me an upfront $1,000 for a 3-minute cue for a corporate inside video, and which isn't a ton of money. We're talking about Disney here. They can afford to pay more than $1,000, but it was more valuable for me to have had Disney as a client than necessarily the $1,000. You know what I mean? The value of it means more to my reel. It means more for any kind of credits, putting that Disney logo on my website, all of that is worth the buyout. And because, the music isn't necessarily precious to me, I know that I can just go and make more. And so, yeah, I was going to do that. But for like games and those types of work for hire situation, typically there is considerably more upfront money. And the difference between a buyout is buyouts don't always necessarily mean work for hire. They can, and this is an instance, and we'll see some other terms later where two things can mean different things in different context. And so one of the licensing agreements that I work with or work under with a publisher is they are buyouts. And the buyout is, I think, like $1. And basically it's a way to say there's no upfront fees, there's no upfront sync license fees. And if this cue were to ever get an upfront sync license, I would not be owed any of that upfront money. I still get the back end. But if they were to take my, my dating show tension cue, for example, and license it and somebody somewhere paid an upfront sync fee, then I wouldn't be entitled to that. Now, why would I sign a deal like that? Well, it's kind of a calculated risk. I don't see a lot of upfront money for dating show tension. It's just not there. We're not talking about a song that I wrote that an editor or a director really, really wants in their show. We're talking about some background music underneath some argument or some human drama. There is no upfront money for those types of placements. There just isn't. So I'm going to sign that deal. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't threaten me. In the off chance that it might get some upfront money, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not going to argue for that. You might also see the term needle drop, which is a pay-per-use license model where the client pays a fee each time the track is used in a production. It's called a needle drop. And we have to be careful because when we get things placed on TV, like for sports, that's not necessarily considered a needle drop. But what might be a needle drop is if a producer or an editor wants to use like a song from Hamilton, then they have to pay a sync fee, and that's considered a needle drop. And every time they were to use it, it would also generate a new fee as opposed to a blanket fee. All right, let's keep going. What is metadata? Now, metadata, another term that means different things in different contexts. If you've been around in the old MP3 player days, you know that metadata is information that gets attached to an audio file. And that can kind of mean that in this context, but when we really talk about metadata, we're talking about information that gets submitted with a cue to a library's catalog system. Things like keywords, description, title, length, sounds like, emotional tags, instrumentation. These are essentially search engine terms that live in the publisher's library catalog. And so we have to do a really good job of wrangling our metadata because it's up to us to make our cues as findable as possible. So metadata is a form of deliverables. Speaking of deliverables, you might see the term alt mixes, aka minus mixes or bed mix or underscore mix, etc., rhythm mix, these types of things. And these are alternate versions of the cue, something like a no melody mix, a mix with minimal instrumentation, or a drone version, or maybe just drums and bass only. These are designed to give editors maximum flexibility. And so Discovery Channel uses the term stems, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and minus mixes. But I've worked with some libraries that just call them all alt mixes or alternate mixes, and it's up to us to generate them. And in general, alt mixes don't need to be remixed and remastered to the final loudness. We just had Biagio Messina on a few weeks ago to talk about all of the different versions of the cues that they need when they are editing a scene. And he called them stems, which are isolated audio files for each major element of a track, drums, bass, melody. This allows editors to remix or rebalance the music. Now, some editors call stems what I think about as alt mixes or alts. But some publishers use stems to include, like, here are all of the marimba sounds. Here are all the piano sounds. Discovery Channel's like this. When I give them stems, it's all of the bass instruments, even if the bass instruments might be electric bass and acoustic bass, and all the percussion, including drums and shakers and cymbals and congas or whatever. Those all get grouped together. It's a little bit different than if you were talking to a mixing engineer. When they ask for stems, they need each individual track isolated because they are going to reassemble your mix. But that's really not what editors are doing. Editors ultimately are looking for versions of the cue at different energy levels that they can use to craft what will essentially sound like an underscore for the scene that they are putting together. And so if you give them all drones and pads and maybe just the shakers or just the percussion, then they can kind of assemble a pads and percussion only mix, because that's what works with the emotion and the dynamics of the scene that they are editing together. If you see the term stems and alt mixes used in a contract or with a library, it's usually a good idea to chat with them and make sure that you're giving them what they are asking for. Okay, and we're coming to the end here, but I want to talk about a couple of other terms that you are probably going to see. An edit point. An edit point is a clearly defined moment in a cue, often on a downbeat or near a resolution. Sometimes it's almost like a cliffhanger moment, but this is where editors can cleanly cut, loop, or transition. Edit points exist within the cue, and they are natural kind of pauses. Editor can go, cut, slice, move things, insert dialogues. It gets a natural point that editors can use to edit around. Now, this is sometimes called a stop down, but when I think of stop downs, I think of a pause or a lull in a cue that's used to reset energy before building back up. Okay, so you can have a build into a stop down and then energy pulls back. This also is very useful for scene changes. But make sure that you communicate with your library. If they say edit points or stop downs, make sure that you know exactly what they're talking about. When I think of stop downs, I think about like moments in like hip hop tracks. Hip hop cues are going to be like cooking along, and then there might be a moment, also called like a vacuum moment, where things just kind of come to a pause and then drop on the other side of that. I have started calling those stop downs to differentiate those from edit points. Again, non-standardized terminology that means different things to different people. Speaking of non-standardized terminology, a button ending. Now, I call all buttons, these are final, clean hits, usually on tonic, on the one chord, usually on the downbeat following the final phrase that clearly ends the cue with tonal resolution, harmonic resolution, rhythmic resolution, melodic resolution, and this is a point, a mobile ending point that editors can use to either cut to, they can kind of fade to black, throw to commercial, act out, or whatever. And they can take this mobile piece and attach it wherever they need it. But it needs to be resolved. It needs to be kind of deliberately an ending, because we can't just slowly fade any cue. We have to give them an ending. But a button ending could mean different things to different people. Some people call buttons really light endings. I call buttons the concept of that ending point. Some other folks will use a term called a stinger ending. And what a stinger ending is a short, dramatic, or attention-grabbing final hit. So think of a button that goes like bum, 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 bum. That's a stinger. Has extra impact, extra flair, and it really punctuates or emphasizes the end of the cue. And Matt Vanderbo has a good video about stinger endings, that they don't just kind of, the loops or whatever, the phrases are cooking and then it just kind of resolves to tonic, but give them a stinger that an editor can cut to. Now, obviously, these aren't all of the terms you will ever see. But these were the I don't even know how many of them I did. These were the terms that I've run into, that I've gotten questions about, that I think we can kind of take it for granted that everybody knows this. But what about you? Do you have any terms that maybe you've seen, but you don't know what they mean? Let me know in the comments below. If you have seen some jargon and you're not sure what it is, ask. Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. And if you have some terms that you have heard that you think we should know about, also, please let us know in the comments below. But that's going to do it for Professor Dave's sync music vocabulary that you should know, but maybe were afraid to ask. So we're going to take a really quick break, and when we return, we are going to take a listen to Merry Go Round, which is my final no pizzicato dramedy cue. We'll be right back. Every week I talk about how this episode and the podcast and the community, the channel, would not be possible without the amazing support of our family, friends, and neighbors, subscribers of 52Qs, who do pay their actual real-life money to keep all of this going. And in addition to being thriving members of the community, as well as supporting me and Shannon and everything that we're doing here, they also receive extra perks like live streams, workshops, Zoom feedback sessions, hundreds and hundreds of hours of video archives, weekly cue breakdowns, production music almanac, living ebook, and the opportunities to submit to real music libraries. Now, it's free to join 52Qs. You can just go to 52qs.com and sign up, be a member of the community. We would love to have you. It will always be free to join the community. But if you've been watching, or if maybe this is your first time, but if you're wondering, is there a way to kind of level up my production music skills in the industry, meeting like-minded, super friendly, very generous composers? Then why don't you think about subscribing? Memberships start at around $4 a month, and we would love to have you. Again, that's 52qs.com. That was Merry Go Round, which is my final no pizzicato dramedy cue that I've been working up. Been working on an album for Discovery Channel, and I got to tell you, I started out really, really strong on this album, and there were 10 cues that I put together. But by the end, I found myself really missing pizzicato for my dramedy. I don't know. I don't really have an issue with libraries not wanting pizzicato for their dramedies, but I keep hearing pizzicatos getting used on TV and in placements, and I don't know, complaining about pizzicato and dramedy is kind of like complaining about all the dominant 7 chords in blues. I think pizzicato is just one of those sounds that make dramedy sound like dramedy. Now, obviously, you can work around that. I found myself doing a ton with marimba and electric piano and even some staccato strings here and there. But by the end, yeah, I had a whole new appreciation for pizzicato strings and how easy it is to get that dramedy vibe using just that instrumentation. For you family and friends subscribers, be on the lookout pretty soon here. I'm going to be doing a complete cue breakdown of Merry-Go-Round, including showing you how I got that really interesting calliope organ kind of sound by running a melodica. This melodica right here, running it through a rotator cabinet, a B3 rotator cabinet, or rotor cabinet. So be on the lookout for that. But that is going to do it for me this week. You definitely want to tune in next week because we have a workshop coming up here next month, not for June, but for July, where I am going to be talking about writing crime and investigation tension cues. And I thought it'd be a really good idea to kind of show the many different sides of light tension. Light tension is a very, very broad category, everything from crime and investigation to tasking to intrigue to problem solving. And so we're going to look at a few of my own light tension cues, and I'm going to give you my ideas for how I kind of separate, the different aspects and the spectrum, the very wide spectrum of light tension. So you definitely want to stick around for that. But I do hope that this has been a good week for you. And if not, I believe that next week is going to be even better. How do I know that? And why do I believe that? It's because I trust and believe that the universe has amazing plans just for you. Until next time, peace. The 52 Cues podcast is copyright 2025 818 Studios, all rights reserved. The music played on the podcast is copyright of their respective owners and is used with permission and for educational purposes only. For more information, including joining the community, submitting your cue for review, or becoming a member subscriber of 52 Cues, head over to 52cues.com.